she opened the conference this morning, perspective on the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, but I thought I would add a bit to give you some background. First, we regard this at the university as a major new undertaking and of potential great consequence. The great consequence will come, of course, over time, because scholarly work of the kind that we envision will take considerable effort and will take the scholarship of very distinguished people that are just now being recruited here to Washington University. At the table outside, I was pleased to see a little advertisement of announcing the minor in religion and politics. This means the center will be drawing talented undergraduates into the program and into engagement. The center is intended not only to be inward-looking to the Washington University community, but also to be outward and engaging with the St. Louis community, to be sure, but with the United States as a whole. This center is focused on religion and politics in America, and we are fortunate to have had tremendous support and encouragement from former Senator John Danforth. He's been very active as we crafted our proposal to have this undertaking in the first place. I interacted with him very substantially together with our distinguished professor, Wayne Fields, and we had a very good time going back and forth on how best to structure this. But this very important center has great beginnings in these wonderful faculty, beginning with the recruitment of Lee Schmidt and Marie Griffith, the first, and they in turn have assisted in recruiting other talented members of our faculty to join in this undertaking. So the impact is growing. We have our next presidential election, at least to some, just a short time away. There are already efforts underway, jockeying, discussion, and we know that it will be another very interesting time. The past presidential election, of course, had the prospect of leading to the election of a Mormon to be president, and that, of course, engendered a lot of discussion during the course of the campaign. But we feel that this is an enduring undertaking. This is not just for the next election or a review of the past. This is an enduring undertaking because we know that religion and politics in America will be a recurring and important, enduring theme of scholarly importance. And so we feel this is a great initiative for us and are privileged to have had the support of the Danforth Foundation in launching the center. We began with a very handsome endowment, and yet, as everyone knows, universities spend every penny they receive, and so we seek additional support for what we do, and we know that we will be able to expand our efforts with additional philanthropic support. One of the commitments of the university, beyond the significant gift from the Danforth Foundation, was the complete renovation or redevelopment of the building that we call Umrath Hall. For those who are in the Washington University community, recall what we did. We took the roof off and then scooped out the insides, and then we had to shore up the walls. That was all that was remaining. And we rebuilt from the inside. We have a beautiful exterior, and now we have a very effective infrastructure inside. The building is dating back to the turn of the last century, and Umrath Hall was developed as a dormitory. And when you think about dormitories of that era, the rooms were small, it was compartmentalized, and we felt the building was completely unworkable with a traditional renovation. So we invested very heavily preserving the exterior beauty of this collegiate Gothic building, but also redeveloping it for the modern purposes associated with the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. So we feel very fortunate that we have great people, we have great facilities now. I think we'll increase our impact through engagements like this, through the online journal, Religion and Politics, that has already had very significant impact. So we're very recruited to Washington University in recent times. I will be leaving because I'm involved in recruiting another candidate, not for the Danforth Center, but I'm trying to recruit another person to the university, so I'll be leaving in a few minutes. But I will hope to see you all as we celebrate Marie Griffith's formal installation as the holder of the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professorship this afternoon at 4:30. But Mark Jordan is a very distinguished person. Of course, we wouldn't have recruited him if he weren't. But to illustrate the strength of what we're doing and the attractiveness to people who are looking to us, it's noteworthy that Professor Jordan is the holder of a new endowed professorship that was created by one of our emeritus trustees, Dr. William Neves. Dr. Neves endowed a professorship in honor of his wife, the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neves, and Mark is the holder of this distinguished professorship here at Washington University. So we're already attracting some of that additional philanthropic support that we're going to need to expand our program. Mark Jordan has held academic positions at a number of important universities. He is a PhD alumnus of the University of Texas at Austin and had positions at Notre Dame, the University of Dallas, at Emory University, and at Harvard immediately before taking up his position here at Washington University. Please join me in welcoming Mark Jordan, our moderator for this afternoon.
It's positively frightening to think that I'm to constitute the principle of moderation in this afternoon's session, but stranger things have happened. Welcome to the afternoon portion of our conversation on American religion and politics across disciplinary boundaries or in defiance of them. Welcome especially to the four panelists who will launch us. In hopes of animating the drowsy hours after lunch, I had considered occupying the session, redirecting the plan, projecting embarrassing childhood photographs of Lee and Marie, and then asking the panelists to improvise interpretations or explanations from one or another disciplinary perspective. But I resolved that we should instead be obedient subjects. So the format is, as before, that each panelist will speak for not more than 15 minutes, a limit to be observed with liturgical precision. There should be plenty of time for us to consider together what they have asked or described or claimed and what it might mean for our thinking and acting. When Lee Schmidt asked me to chair this panel, he commanded that I should provide only spare introductions for the panelists. He was no doubt worried about my continental taste in tangled metaphors and rhythmic rhetorical repetitions. Or perhaps it was my penchant for bad jokes. So now, in the style of the rather humorless American Ernest Hemingway, I introduce our panelists as briefly as possible and in the order in which they will speak. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her book, Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, shows how church mothers draw on the energies of sanctification for the power to lead communities both inside and outside church walls. Next year, we can look forward to another sort of book, The Gospel According to Sarah, How Sarah Palin and the Tea Party Are Galvanizing the Religious Right. My money's on Tina Fey for the audiobook, but a very public voice on religious questions, Professor Butler is one of the most vivid contributors and one of the guardian angels of the website Religion Dispatches. Sarah Barringer Gordon is Adams Professor of Constitutional Law and Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. Her first book takes up the question of Mormon polygamy as a way into larger constitutional conflicts in the 19th century. More recently, more sweepingly, she has written on the groundswell of litigation since the 1940s over the boundaries between government and religion, especially litigation brought by religious dissenters. She is now at work on a study of religion and property in American history. I will testify to her knowledge of arcane property law. You must ask her about the extraordinary case of Boo Boo, Dockers, and Tulip before the Supreme Court of California. Eric Gregory is professor of religion at Princeton University. He has written widely and elegantly on religious and philosophical ethics, not least in relation to law and public life. You can see the possibilities from the almost paradoxical title of his book, Politics and the Order of Love, an Augustinian ethic of democratic citizenship. Professor Gregory is currently at work on a project about globalization and the gospel ethic of responsibility to strangers. He is also editing the Cambridge Companion to Reinhold Niebuhr, St. Augustine, Wave of the Future. If anyone can bring it about, I believe that Professor Gregory can. Mark Valeri is the Thompson Professor of Church History at Union Presbyterian Seminary. His most recent book has the delightful title, Heavenly Merchandise: How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America. The book testifies to persistent interest in questions about religion and the economy, but he hardly slights theological intricacies. Professor Valeri has edited a volume of sermons and discourses for the collected works of Jonathan Edwards, a badge of honor and of suffering, if not a visible sign of election. He has also edited, with two of my colleagues at the Danforth Center, an anthology of essays on the rich variety of Protestant practices across American history. And he is at work, if I understand correctly, on travel narratives, religious skepticism, and conversion in 18th century America. Those are our splendid panelists. I now yield the floor to them, beginning with Professor Butler.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really would like to thank both Lee and Marie for having me here. They have known me for a very long time, and they know that they've watched me grow in very lots of different ways, and I am grateful for their support and to the support of many of the people who are here in this room today who have made me possible. And it's interesting because they've asked me to talk about African American religion and politics, except I have a confession to make. And that confession is, I never thought about this subject very much because I wanted to avoid it. But the reason why I've had to come to it, especially in the last 5 years, is because of the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States. My research interests are, as I like to tell my students, I like people who say no a lot. And people who say no are much more interesting to me than people who say yes. Because the people who say no are people who have high boundaries. They have scruples. They have things that they believe in fervently. They have things that they want to fight about. And because of that, while I've been looking at people on the right who have been saying no a lot, I've had to look at African American religious history a different way and to realize that we have a lot of people who say no too. And those people who say no are saying no to a variety of different things. So while I am a historian of African American religion, my commentary today is going to focus on contemporary issues with an eye to historical fissures in the African American community about the role of religion in the public realm and the political realm. It's always comforting for all of us to sort of think back on the civil rights movement, especially a week after the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, as this monolithic Black religious response to racial discrimination. That's a hagiographical version. There were lots of tensions within the African American community about how this should be brought about. Is it accommodationist view? Do we wait and see what happens through legal means? Do we march? Do we not march? All of these questions permeated people in African American churches and life. But there's a much more complex political and religious structure of African American religion. And today, I'm going to focus mostly in on Christianity because that's what I do. But I want to just make a brief mention at the end, especially to go back to the morning panel and the gentleman who talked about Muslims and talk about this as a way to think about where we might be going in the future. While last week's celebration of the 50th anniversary of the March of Washington was viewed through the lens of the Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and it was very interesting to see how that speech was appropriated last week. If some of you know, it was shown on MSNBC in its entirety twice during the day, and most of the time, when I teach my Martin and Malcolm class, my students have never heard the entire speech. I make them read it, we dissect it. It's always very surprising to them because they don't know that speech. They only know a couple of lines from it, and they think they know the speech. But it changes everything. But also, something else different happened last week. What happened last week, because it was the 50th anniversary, were that other names who were very crucial to the speech were mentioned. A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and others. And I thought, in a sense, that this was a good way to begin because those voices provide a different kinds of lens for what we need to think about is going to be the future of Black religion and politics in this country. Because there are issues right now that are pressing from without that are changing the ways in which we have to think about Black political and religious life. One very big important thing that is changing that is the rollback from the Supreme Court of the Voting Rights Act. That is a crucial moment, and that will change the way we see things in 2014 and especially 2016. The second, which is going to sound a little strange but different, is the rolling of the Supreme Court on DOMA that ruled that that was unconstitutional. Okay? So these two things, although they look very much not affiliated with each other, they really are because they represent two very big things that the Black church has been involved in. One is voting, and second is same-sex marriage for a variety of reasons. The rise of the Tea Party and the Republican Party's insistence on becoming a lot more to the right instead of the middle has also changed how Black religion and politics will be seen in this sort of what I term a 40-year turnaround in how Black religious life has been reshaped regarding political action in the U.S. Now, let me tell you what changed my thinking about this. One semester while I was at the University of Pennsylvania, I had to teach this past spring Martin and Malcolm in the morning. I had a 30-minute break, and then I went to teach my Religious Right in America class. And what I realized by doing both of those back-to-back, juxtaposed with each other, was that I was doing a very broad kind of history that was going parallel to each other. One was the history of the civil rights movement, but the other was the history in which how the religious right had appropriated some things from the civil rights movement and turned them into their own. And what I came to start to think about March last year was that maybe the people on the right had done the civil rights movement better than the civil rights movement. And that's a frightening thought, because what they had done is they had mobilized, and not only had they mobilized, they had created a way in which all of the things that happened in the post-civil rights movement, where you saw African Americans becoming mayors, congresspeople, everything else, all of that was being rolled away, and now what we see is the Tea Party and their types of conservatives coming into power. And so when I'm talking today, I'm talking about something that a couple of us have sort of termed the new Nader. The old Nader was never a Nader in the first place, but I think that this second half of what we're going through, especially in Black religion and politics, is a different kind of Nader, and it's frightening to think about that Nader happening with the election of the nation's first African-American president. Let me give you 4 specific ways in which I think this reshaping has happened. First, There is a decline in the traditional black politics during the presidency of Barack Obama. The usual suspects, and I'll talk about those in a minute, are not the usual suspects anymore. And there are internecine battles that have ripped apart the normal fabric of coalitions. And those coalitions have been between churches and organizations and things like that, and I'll talk about why I think that's a problem. Second, the rise of the prosperity gospel and the shift in the focus from community concerns to individual economic and religious concerns. And here I'm thinking about people like T.D. Jakes, Eddie Long, et cetera. I'll talk a little bit about how that's affected the black community in politics in a minute. Third, the attrition of some traditionalist black churches to side with issues that are more associated with evangelicalism and the conservative religious right. Here I'm thinking about abortion and same-sex marriage. You might think back to 2004 and how Karl Rove used this effectively to be able to create a wedge in places like Ohio where he could draw black votes over to George W. Bush, the kinds of things that the Bush administration did with giving black pastors money to work in the community, sort of almost like a payoff in a sense, playing on some old ways in which people got things from political figures and churches, but they used it very differently. Now I'm thinking these days about Bishop Harry Jackson, and if you want to go further back, you can, and I know a lot of people won't recognize his name, E.V. Hill, who was a great friend of Ronald Reagan. Okay? And then the fourth, grassroots organizing as a response to crisis. And now you might say, oh, this is the turn back to the normal civil rights movement. That's true, but the grassroots organizing is coming from different places now. I'm thinking about Moral Mondays in North Carolina with the Reverend William Barber, and people like the Dream Defenders in Florida who sat in on the governor's mansion in order to try to get the change in the Stand Your Ground law. All of these can be summed up in three words that I think create a very big tension in black politics right now: purity, prosperity, and policy. The confluence of these three issues, and I'm thinking about purity as who has the right to say what happens with black politicians and black churches and how these things go together. Prosperity, is it material prosperity, or do we want prosperity for all? Are we looking at how to bring the poor up, or is it just prosperity for individuals? And policy, how do you begin to work to change policies that have been rolled back, that were fought from the initial civil rights movement, that have been eroded now by the courts and states' rights, basically? The confluence of these, coupled with other factors, have made the prospect for the black church in politics in 2014 and 2016 to be a fraught, contentious issue. Unlike Professor Eddie Glaude, who's at Princeton, who made a very big comment that has haunted all of us for a long time, is the black church dead? I don't think the black church is dead, but I do think it is crippled. And it is crippled in many different kinds of ways, and part of that is about the political activities that are happening and that are not happening. So let me briefly take 4 different vignettes to open this up for you. The first is President Obama, then candidate Obama, in March and April of 2008 and Jeremiah Wright. We all know this, we know what happened, the goddamn America that went on an endless loop, but I saw this a very different way. While everyone else was thinking about how Reverend Jeremiah Wright had been thrown under the bus, my contention was back then was that Barack Obama did not only throw Jeremiah Wright underneath the bus, he threw the whole black church underneath the bus. And the reason why I say that, and that is a very volatile statement to make, is that he discarded all of the old coalitions that were happening. If you remember, Hillary Clinton had a lot of black pastors that were behind her during the election cycle who didn't really want to come over to Barack Obama during this time period. But by getting rid of Jeremiah Wright, the then candidate Obama sent a signal, and that signal was, I'm not going to buy into these old coalitions anymore. These things are destroyed. And if you've seen throughout the 2 administrations, the ways in which African-American pastors have been dealt with are very different. I'm thinking about last April when there was a prayer meeting at the White House, and it was a group of lots of different pastors from around the country. What President Obama did was take 5 minutes with some of the pastors, black pastors, and pull them off to the side, and that was it. About a week and a half ago, he met with certain groups from the AME Zion, other black Baptist groups. He didn't meet with the largest black denomination in the country, Church of God in Christ. Why did he not meet with them? I submit to you that he decided that I don't need those coalitions to do what I need to do. Now what he has are surrogates, and I'm going to talk about this issue of surrogacy because it becomes very important. This other piece of this battle has been between figures that the Black community knows very much in terms of making policy. Whereas we've had this sort of issue about, figures like King and others, we have these same kind of figures now, except they form very differently. One of those is Professor Cornel West, who is now at Union Seminary, who was at Princeton before. And he has been very, very critical of President Obama. And I want to quote something he said about Al Sharpton just last week that created a firestorm on Twitter. Professor West said, "Brother Martin himself, I think, would be turning over in his grave." And he's talking about the event that happened last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago, that was a march on Washington that Al Sharpton and his coalition put together. He said, "King would have wanted people to talk about Wall Street criminality. He wants people to talk about war crimes or drones dropping bombs on innocent people. Instead," he lamented, "we saw the coronation of the bona fide house Negro of the Barack Obama plantation, our dear brother Al Sharpton." West went further, declaring that Sharpton's decline was supported by MSNBC analyst Michael Dyson and others who've prostituted themselves in an ugly and vicious way. This gets to the issue of surrogacy. So if Barack Obama doesn't have to use the church anymore, he can have surrogates that are in other places. And I should note that even though I've been on MSNBC, I'm not a surrogate. I want to put that very clearly out there. But I do think what this is a sense of a battle. And, Cornel West and Tavis Smiley had been responsible for years and during the 2000 era of having these thing on Black America, sort of the state of Black America. Every year these things happen, and they gathered religious figures and political figures and everyone else, and that is all gone now. So all of that has been wiped away because of this symbolic figure of President Barack Obama being elected. Now I'm going to talk about the symbolism at the end. Second, prosperity gospel. All of you know what this is. It's the health and wealth doctrine that we used to talk about, old in Pentecostalism, that got renamed new. This focus on economic uplift as well as a social kind of uplift changed the way that Black churches began to operate. So if we think about mega churches like Eddie Long's church or Creflo Dollar's church in Atlanta, which became sort of a center for all of this, what happened was those churches had conservative sort of teachings, but they were also thinking about economic means. And they did not so much focus on the political. They made people turn inward to think about individualism. So it was about, you need to get a house, you need to get all these different kinds of things. But at the same time in 2008, when Barack Obama was ascending in September of 2008, the mortgage crisis and the bottom fell out of everything. What happened to many of those people in those churches? They lost their homes. They became foreclosed upon. The nation, in terms of African Americans' wealth, has gone down tremendously since 2008. Okay? So this focus on prosperity, while people put their efforts into this in the 90s and 2000s, has left them outside of the normal political realm. Because they thought about the economic piece, it reshaped the ways in which they acted politically. And I'm thinking here especially about Eddie Long, and I want to just tell this story very briefly. Eddie Long, as you know, was a large pastor who was found in, a bad situation with 4 young men who sued him because they said they had had sexual relations with him. Prior to that, however, Eddie Long's greatest achievement was to have the funeral of Coretta Scott King at his church, and that was partially because of her daughter, Bernice King, being on the staff there. And at that time when this funeral happened, George Bush was there, Clinton was there. He was a rising figure. He was also against same-sex marriage. Okay? And he protested in the streets of Atlanta with Bernice King walking alongside of him, and now all of that has come to ruin because of his own infidelities and indiscretions. Now what has happened is all those coalitions that he built are gone away. And those coalitions were built not on other kinds of political means, but on moral means. And so that's another way in which this tension, I believe, is a big one for the future of African American religion and politics. Third, traditionalists. I call these traditionalists in part because these are the people who we haven't really looked at, and I think this is a really important area of study right now, which I'm starting to look into, are Black conservatives. And here I'm thinking about people like Bishop Harry Jackson outside of Washington, D.C., E.W. Jackson in Virginia, who's running for lieutenant governor, who said a lot of crazy things. Let me give you one quote. Planned Parenthood has been far more lethal to Black lives than the KKK ever was. Why would he say something like that? Well, in part, he says something like that because people like Harry Jackson or Herman Cain and others have also bought into a different way of thinking about their personhood. And one of the big rises right now that has drawn in a lot of Black churches in a different way politically has been the rise of groups like MAFA 21 and the Frederick Douglass Society that are positing a bigger role for African Americans in conservative life and to talk about how African Americans have been hurt by things like abortion and the different kinds of governmental regulations that have destroyed what Black life used to be. And so they are, too, just like the Tea Party and everybody else, hearkening back to a different time, except what they're saying is that if we would just go back to this time politically when we might have been, not be able to go to the same schools and everything else, but we had stability in our communities. We had a way in which we covered for each other. Those are the kinds of traditionalist thinking that I think that are changing the way that Black churches are going. And then finally, this idea about grassroots organizing. And this seems to be, I would say, a way in which we've always traditionally thought about Black churches in the civil rights movement. But now what we see is something very different. This grassroots organizing is pushing back against rollbacks in law. So if we talk about what happened in the 2012 election with souls to the polls in Florida, with all of the voter ID laws that came up, how churches began to respond to that to try to bring people out to the polls and get them there and to stand in line hours and hours and hours on end. If we think about what's happening in North Carolina right now with the rollback in just about everything, I mean, not just voter ID, but everything. And almost, I would say, in a way, a creation of a theocratic state in a certain kind of way. When you see someone like the Reverend William Barber, who has been on many media outlets, leading people to be arrested on Moral Mondays, all of these things have a connection to traditional ways in which the Black churches had to operate both spiritually and politically. The difference is now is that it is to recapture ground that has been lost, and that there is no real sense in which that these organizations can count on the stronger organizations that have been in the African American community, like the NAACP or the National Council of Negro Women, and other organizations that have lost membership in the last few years. And now this network that used to work together so well, and this is kind of the sociological piece, doesn't work the same way anymore. They don't have a place to ground themselves. And so how do these groups, like the Dream Defenders and others, gain traction nationally? They may be able to gain traction locally, but they can't gain traction nationally. So where does this leave us? One place I think it leaves us is with a sense of foreboding. I look at what is happening right now in African American religious life and politics, and I do not know what 2014 and 2016 will bring. The Voting Rights Act, which can barely be enforced now with the Department of Justice being hobbled in certain kinds of ways, will be very difficult for these groups to come together. The battles that have happened, and we've had these battles that have happened before in African American religious history about, whether it's someone like W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington, these same kinds of things are playing themselves out over and over and over again. But I think one book that I wanted to bring up is very instructive, and that's Frederick C. Harris's book, The Price of the Ticket, which talks about President Barack Obama and his symbolic effect on the African American community. In one sense, the election of President Obama was this grand moment. He stands as a symbol, almost like a saint, in other words, in a certain kind of way, to the African American community. But his election has also opened up what I just have to really call the pit of racial hell. And that pit of racial hell has been an endless stream of vitriol and vitriolic behavior on the part of those who did not ever want to see an African American president. Part of what has happened is because the symbol means so much to those in the African American community as the first black president, it's also become very difficult for these churches to move forward. It's become very difficult to move forward politically when you have a president that says he's a president for all people, but at the same time this community has lost a lot of clout. So those are some things I want to put out there today. I hope we can talk about them later in the discussion, and please feel free to ask whatever you want to ask, and I'll try to answer it. Thank you.
Now that's a lot to think about, and a tough act to follow, I have to say. But it is such a pleasure to be here with my friend and colleague Anthea and Lee and Marie, but also the friends of Lee and Marie, who I have very much enjoyed getting to know a little bit. And I hope I can stay in touch with you. It's also a pleasure to be here at the Danforth Center and to see the fantastic colleagues that they have recruited, and to be part, I think, of building something path-breaking here, taking religion as seriously as politics and doing substantive and qualitative work, all the best things that scholars do. And I have to say, I'm really grateful that you included an old country lawyer, which is most gratifying. I consider my fields to be law, religion, and history. And I have to tell you, a lot of American history has happened and is still happening in courtrooms. From my perspective, cases and legal arguments and debates about legal change all deserve more attention from religion scholars. I kid you not, they are a gold mine. Just to give one example, let me talk about another 50th anniversary that is happening right now. Consider the long-lasting effects of a case called Abington School District against Shemp, decided in 1963. That Supreme Court decision held that it's unconstitutional for states to require that the school day for public school students must begin with Bible reading and recitation of the Lord's Prayer. School prayer and Bible reading have been controversial in America for at least 150 years, but only for the past 50 years or so has the Supreme Court of the United States been at the center of the storm. Everyone seems to love to hate Supreme Court opinions on religion. And truly, the justices have baked something extremely messy and smelly. They fight with each other, they disagree with past decisions, and generally, nobody thinks they really got it right. Honestly, though, the law of religion is difficult to make sense of, even among sensible people. The importance of both religion and law in American life have long been noted. Almost 200 years ago, the original talking head, Alexis de Tocqueville, or pundit, right, marveled at the power of law and lawyers in American society. Every major question in American life, even in the early 19th century, sooner or later became a lawsuit. Tocqueville also stressed how vital religion was to the new nation, but he never connected the dots. The enduring force of law, particularly what we call the rule of law on the one hand, and the great diversity and creativity of American religious life on the other hand, mean that the government has enormous power to affect the ways that believers in America inhabit sacred as well as secular life. Given the importance of the interests involved, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that the law of religion has grown knotted and tangled over the centuries. When our Constitution demands that we not establish religion or interfere with free exercise We may all want to do what the Constitution commands, but we may also disagree about what that means on the ground, whether it be school prayer, tax exemptions, employment discrimination, health care mandates, you name it, it comes up. So there is plenty going on, and a large swath of intelligent people working on the complexities of law and religion. I inhabit, I can show you the bruises, a hard-hitting and smart field. But we have a central problem. That is, almost everybody thinking and writing and analyzing these questions is a lawyer. Hundreds of learned articles, dozens of books, plenty of amicus briefs on one side of another of complex questions. All of these are the product of lawyers. Religion scholars, I'm saying it to you straight, tend to skip the whole law thing. They have done brilliant work on religious practice and ritual, on personal discipline, on prayer, secularism, the definition of religion. I could go on. From my own selfish perspective, the history of religion is particularly luscious right now, thanks to the work of many people sitting here in this room. But from the religion side, there are vanishingly few entrants into the legal waters, even though much of religious life is deeply affected by law. The two sides are talking distinct languages, in fact. Lawyers are caught up in the ways that religious passions play out in law. They see the effects of religious change in the clients that come to them, but they never focus on how the experience with law ends up channeling religious change and commitment. The effects of legal action truly are beyond their ken. Scholars of religion, at least from where I sit, also have a lot to bring to the table. Modes of analysis and ways of describing commitment and behavior that are simply outside the scope of legal vision. And yet, there are only the most infrequent interactions. Lawyers, I have to tell you, are by nature interdisciplinary, and I have to say, Eric's question about being imperialistic about it, they're very imperialistic. They will use anything, theories, research, history, statistics, people, you name it. Whatever advances the interest of their client or their law review article, they will use. Right now, just to give you one example, a whole bunch of them are caught up in debating whether or not the investiture controversy of the 12th century was the true origin of the doctrine of separation of church and state. Honestly, I know that some of us historians are more comfortable lumping than splitting, but that lump is just too big, right? And we need to help people understand that. That is too grand a leap. But almost nobody is looking closer to home, trying to figure out how we arrived at a place where separation of church and state is more or less a reality, and deep and widespread religious commitments are also flourishing. How, for heaven's sake, did that happen? We need to understand not just the legal theory, but the history of religious life in America to figure that out at the places where law and religion have met. And as I said, there is no shortage of this stuff. We can see how this world has been constructed. It is a fascinating and much needed form of historical analysis, but there's not enough of it out there. I want to mention, if I could now, the case that I started with at the outset, Abington School District against Shemp, the Bible reading case. And I want to, if I could, bring it home to some of the audience here. The majority opinion in the case was businesslike. It was short. It found daily reading of the Bible over a public school PA system and then recitation of the Lord's Prayer was a religious exercise. This exercise violated the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, the court said. Done, dusted. But a long and comprehensive occurrence by the then young Justice William Brennan set out his theory of the Establishment Clause and its place in American life. At this point, Brennan was a new member of the court. He was appointed by Eisenhower. Where's Bob Wesnow? By Eisenhower in 1956. But Brennan had recently acquired significant gravitas in the law of religion. He was the author of a game-changing opinion in 1963 in a case called Sherbert against Werner. The case involved a worker, Mrs. Sherbert, who had been fired because her garment factory in North Carolina, can't you say North Carolina, right? Had begun requiring employees to work on Saturday. Mrs. Werner refused, claiming that as a practicing Seventh-day Adventist, Saturday was her Sabbath. The State Unemployment Commission refused to give her unemployment compensation because, they said, she had been fired for cause. Only 2 years earlier, a similar case had reached the Supreme Court and the worker had lost. Justice Brennan had dissented in 1961 in the first case, but 2 years later, in the Sherbert case, he persuaded a majority of the court that they had made a mistake, and now his dissent became a majority opinion and changed the way we think about religious rights. The government of North Carolina, Brennan said, had no business forcing Mrs. Sherbert to choose between violating her religion and starvation. This was a tectonic shift. Combined with the school prayer and Bible reading cases of that same year, the jurisprudence of religion had undergone a major refit at the hands of a Supreme Court that had also made a lot of noise about race and now dug its paws into religion. One thing worth noting, just to give you a sense of the reaction to these opinions, is that the school prayer cases prompted more hate mail than any other case in United States history. Any other case. So when Brennan took up his pen in the Abington case, he was both at the height of his power and very much aware that he was playing with fire. He wrote a 90-page concurrence in which he tried to explain how he understood the operation of the ban on Bible reading and school prayer should work. He wrote, and here I'm quoting, "The holding of the court today plainly does not foreclose teaching about the Holy Scriptures or about the differences between religious sects in classes on literature and history. Indeed, whether or not the Bible is involved, it would be impossible to teach meaningfully many subjects in the social sciences or the humanities without mention of religion." Teaching about religion rather than conducting religious exercises is what Brennan was after. The secular study of the sacred, he said, is not just permitted, it's essential to good education. And indeed, teaching about religion, thanks in significant part to Schempp, became a staple of higher education. I am looking at a room full of this product, even in places at Wash U, which traditionally was very resistant to this very enterprise, right? Early on, scholars of religion credited Schempp for the invigoration, at least if not the outright invention, of religious studies. The new field was dedicated explicitly to the study of religion using secular standards. To give you a sense of the speed of the transition, Schempp was decided in 1963. In 1964, the National Association of Bible Instructors changed its name to the American Academy of Religion. Yes, theology out, right? Polymethodism and meaning interdisciplinary work, was in, right? Clearly, of course, the study of religion is much older than the Schempp opinion. Just think of the scientific study folks that Lee talked about yesterday. But just as clearly, the Schempp case gave the study of religion a revised mandate, a template for how to occupy a new constitutional space designed for scholars, deepening and sharpening the divide between seminaries and religion departments, for example, and in many cases, providing a new justification for the formation of religion departments, even at state public institutions. I want to close by turning back to my earlier diatribe about the lack of scholars in law and religion who actually approach the field from the study of religion. Justice Brennan loved what lawyers call experts. That is, someone who has advanced training and deep knowledge about a given field, who can testify in court about what something means, some disputed thing means, be it Mrs. Sherbert's Saturday worship or the effects on the old order Amish of having their children stay in high school past a certain age, or the potential harm to a Native American community of, cutting down all the trees in a sacred forest, that kind of thing. Brennan believed deeply that experts could explain to judges how best to understand and then evaluate the claims of religious folk. In this way, Brennan hoped not just for fairness, but also for peace. Trained and sober, get that, experts explaining the religious sensibilities of mystics and cranks, right, is not the same thing, Pache William James, as listening to those mystics and cranks yourself. But the great plan for scholarly takeover of the analysis of religion in courts hasn't worked out. In religious studies, big questions such as the meaning of secularisms, fighting over the status of theology in the academy, terrific studies of pluralism, lived religion, and so on, make the field a very exciting one. But almost nobody thinks that the law of religion is today's big thing. And I want to recruit some of you to my side. This is an evangelism message. The thing I want to leave you with that is, I think, something of a comeback to what Anthea was talking about, is that Justice Brennan was very upset about it, but nonetheless, his vision of the religion clauses has been systematically dismantled now by his fellow justices. So the Schempp case and its long concurrence honestly are now artifacts, primary sources for the study of legal history and especially for the evolution of religious studies. Both the establishment and free exercise clauses now occupy smaller spaces than when Justice Brennan called for scholarship on religion as an aid to both education and adjudication. And yet, religious life has flourished in the same period, filling more rather than less space. Religious studies has the potential to help us rethink the constitutional law of religion, if only some of these great scholars would expand their gaze to include the ways that the state and religion interact in a constitutional order. Thank you.
Like others, I'd like to express my gratitude for the invitation. It is an honor to be here to celebrate the center and to honor Lee and Marie. And also, like a couple of the other panelists, I too want to begin with a confession. As a scholar of Augustine, I tend to be skeptical of the genre of confession as a form of self-deception. but my confession is one of ambivalence about the Danforth Center. And that ambivalence is rooted in my friendship, intellectual comradeship with Lee and Marie. But I will just say Princeton's loss is Wash U's terrific gain. Lee, in his remarks yesterday, talked about how historians take the capital letters off the big words. And I guess my stereotype role here is to put the capital letters back on the big words we talk about. So I will also play my part. However, I will say that one of the virtues of Lee and Marie's scholarship, and at least something I try to do, is to tack between the historical and the normative, admitting that we always do that anyway. I have noticed that many discussions of religion and politics focus on the role of religion in shaping public policy, elections, or background cultural divisions. And this, for the most part, has been the tenor of our conversation. And this approach usually focuses on questions of power and interest. I suspect that is what attracts most of my Princeton undergraduates, trained in the arts of suspicion, to courses on religion and politics in our context of religious and anti-religious ferment. They see two cultures, red and blue. They prefer to locate themselves in a humanitarian space beyond both religion and politics. But they are anxious and curious about their exotic fellow citizens. We've talked about polls. One of my favorite polls shows a surprisingly large percentage of Americans who believe Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. Other approaches to our topic track what are sometimes called normative debates about the appropriate role of religion in politics, especially in liberal societies governed by appeals to rights, equality, freedom. Its concerns are not so much power and interest, but legitimacy and authority, reflecting a classical Republican, small r Lee, Republican focus on restraining the domination of arbitrary power. It is invested with value. As such, whether in social science or in philosophy, or dare I say in jurisprudence, religion is usually evaluated from the perspective of politics, or the goods that politics aims to preserve, like order, solidarity, justice. The tone tends to assume religion is a particularly dangerous ideological threat to pluralist politics. It stands in need of rational discipline, characteristically expressed through the rule of law as a civilizing discourse that chastens the wildness of religion. Its popularity stems from the influence of political visions that seek to constrain religion and reflects a modern view of how Westerners, exhausted by religious violence, responding to the facts of pluralism, try to think about and practice politics without appeal to divinity. My brief remarks take a different, though related approach. They concern the nature and purposes of politics from the perspective of religion. Not what religion has to do with politics, but what politics has to do with religion. I think this is a question Senator Danforth himself asks in his book, Faith and Politics, where he writes, "It's not whether religious convictions matter, but how they matter." Now, what binds all of these different approaches is a concern about religious engagement in our public life, what we might call the ethics of democratic citizenship. Many of my colleagues in religious studies, informed by work in anthropology, spend a lot of time interrogating the category religion. And for our purposes, historicizing the seemingly natural division, religion and politics, as itself an unacknowledged artifact of a particular way of imagining the world, even a religious imagination. For some, it is a Christian imagination that owes much to a 5th century culture warrior, mystic, and certainly a crank, who I spend a lot of time trying to understand. Augustine of Hippo is famous for his story about two rival cities, shaped by two rival loves, two rival desires, that are entangled in hidden ways throughout history, and his distinction between the temporal and the eternal, that is thought, at least by lumpers, to provide the soil for much later developments of the separation of church and state. Now, Augustine himself was neither a liberal nor a Democrat. He supported religious coercion. He's not the first name on the list of those known for virtues of self-restraint, respect for diversity, openness to deliberation, all of the virtues, the democratic virtues, universities like WashU and Princeton celebrate. Perhaps recalling Anthea's remarks, for every yes, we can, Augustine might say, no, we can't. But in responding to the shattered ideals of Rome, by warning Christians not to make the empire their religion, some credit him with practically inventing the idea of religion and secular politics as distinct spheres in this wicked world. Modern Augustinians like Reinhold Niebuhr, drawing upon a Protestant emphasis on the malleability of culture and responsibility for our political arrangements, reconstructed his democratic language, his theology, to align the invocation of the image of God and original sin in positive relation to democratic language about the dignity of individuals and limited government. It so happens the feast day of St. Augustine coincided with the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, something I'd not realized until this year. And I wrote a book arguing that Martin Luther King was the great Augustinian of American politics, not Reinhold Niebuhr. So our topic, at least these remarks might suggest, is rather complicated if we think that supposedly neutral approaches to religion and politics are always already implicated in religious histories and even tacit religious assumptions. Part of my teaching tries to get students interested in where different ways of thinking about religion and politics come from, including modes of reasoning that trouble these categories, expanding their conceptual repertoire, offering them modes of thinking as foreign languages. In fact, some of the more interesting social critics in American life today, both religious and secular, expose the religiosity of our politics. Not simply the routine displays of civil religion that excite cable news, but the enchanting patterns of group identity, violence, and sacrifice that suggest the modern nation-state occupies the place of the sacred for citizens in America, for a world that no longer really experiences God as a divine presence. Heralds of cosmopolitanism, globalization may tell us the nation-state is fading, just as liberals claim religion is really what you do with your solitude. But these critics argue our ideal theories about religion and politics are often blind to the passionate existential nature of politics, revealed in moments of national crisis, like waging wars of sad necessity that require language of sacred honor to mobilize citizens in a surveillance state creeping towards permanent war. Despite Niebuhr's revival as a tonic of humility and realism in the face of the new ironies of American history, many theologians today argue American Christians have replaced being Christian with being American, fueling mutual accusations between those who think religion is a conversation stopper and those who think democratic culture is bad for religion. In its most sublime moments, leaders like Abraham Lincoln and King expressed the commitments of our nation in terms of a shared identity, of common bonds of affection, what has been called the common good. Their religious language, which engaged others at their best, not their worst, which elevated rather than chastised, offered our country ways to articulate what our republic stands for, even a practical reasoning about our means and our ends. In both Jewish and Christian traditions, however, there is an enduring concern about sacralizing politics. It's called idolatry. Politics, on this view, is neither an end in itself nor the source of our authenticity. The best politics, according to these religious traditions, knows something other than politics. It puts some distance between politics and what we most care about. The great temptation of politics is thinking you have direct reference to God's purposes, or any science of human nature that makes moral action transparent to itself, a theme powerfully recalled in Lincoln's second inaugural. Since the state is not an agent of salvation, there are goods for which the state cannot and should not be responsible. This view has promoted religious liberty, but it is often attached to a bleak attitude about human possibility. Things can always get worse. There are no good choices, only lesser evils full of tragic loss, not just in places like Syria. We mourn, we pray, we wait. Politics may be under divine providence, but it is opaque to us. All the real action of our lives is external to history. Here I'm riffing on a kind of version of Augustine's influence on the Christian tradition. Abolitionist and social reformer Catherine Beecher, elder sister to Harriet Beecher Stowe, worried about this religious despair. Comfortable with injustice as long as you feel sad about it, as long as you practice charity. Benevolence, she thought, is not a good enough thing in a fallen world. In a striking formulation referring to Augustine, she wrote, "We must combat the, quote, Anglo-Saxon enslavement of African bodies, but we must also combat the African enslavement of the Anglo-Saxon mind." For Beecher, religious piety must be linked to the work of earthly justice. For much of our history, democratic practices that link religious discipleship and political citizenship, that mix time and eternity, have been taken to be part of a work of redemption, mediated through dense webs of institutions and movements, to find, as Zizek says, the Holy Spirit in politics. On this view, religious virtue need not compete with civic virtue and is best displayed through attending to the dispositions of our character, not our professed beliefs of whether or not we believe in God. Politics signals what we care about, what we value, to use an Augustinian notion, what we love. Some progressive and conservative Jews and Christians condemn America's loves today, full stop. Nothing is religiously interesting about America other than its sins of individualism, militarism, or secularism. But the enduring legacy of efforts to enact godly politics, to find what theologian Karl Barth would call secular parables of the kingdom, pose a challenge both to these alternative religious visions and to the dominant liberal understanding of politics about where we might find and shape and form a sense of justice. They raise not simply the question about the place of religious argument in public life, the issue that dominates a good deal of normative discussions about religion and politics in political theory and in legal philosophy. I believe there are moral constraints in public discourse, but I find the increasingly arcane and technical, ironically, discussions about how citizens should argue in public misleading. I worry it privileges certain types of elite speech at odds with a democratic sensibility that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom in our democratic discourse, subject them to criticism with whatever reasons we have to offer. Restrictions on religious speech in public life strike me as impractical, historically naive, self-defeating, because they encourage resentment by religious citizens, and anti-democratic. Let me come to an end here. We face difficult choices. Our policies and our budgets reflect our loves. Should we combat poverty more aggressively, even if it lowers our GDP, even if it risks our national security? How do we coordinate our obligations to distant strangers versus our obligations to fellow citizens? How do we fight terrorism justly? How do we respond to things which, despite all of our power, we can't fix? How do we remember our nation's sins? For many, utilitarian calculators are the only way to think about politics in an age of technique. I am wary, as a good Augustinian, of demanding too much from politics, turning the world on fire. But I think we stand at a decisive moment in our nation's history, not to mention religious history. Both parties strike me as undergoing intellectual crises. And new religious commissions may be emerging, but our remarkably tolerant young generation says getting rich is the main goal of their peers. Public debate, as in times past, needs to be replenished by deeper stories about our interconnectedness that would do well to tap into religious vocabulary in breaking the spell of economic and security interests narrowly defined. For this, I think we need a new coalition politics that embraces more religion in public life, not less. Even, dare I say, theological literacy. That's my evangelism. In the face of skepticism and nostalgia, much depends on whether our generation can energize religious traditions to move beyond vague concern or just mild guilt about the state of the world. How do we modify our political situation even if we can't radically change the structures of human cruelty? That is, I think, an empirical question, and I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the social sciences. But it also requires virtues necessary to sustain commitment and righteous anger in the face of despair. For a new generation, at least in my classes, who are cynical of both religion and politics, how do we as scholars provide constructive visions rather than mere critique, genealogy, or Weberian lament, things we're very good at? How do we offer, whether it's in public life or to our students, something to live for rather than simply stand against? Thank you.
Last go-around. Lee and Marie, you know how much I wish you the best on the adventure, the center, all the members of the center, and especially how much I treasure our very long friendship. So my task, if I understand it rightly, is to speak as a historian of early America, and I must admit, a little nervous going last. We tend to think chronologically as historians. We should end in the present, beginning, but I can see how things are working together a little bit because my comments provide maybe a big historical picture in which to fit a lot of the comments on race, on law, on Augustine, and the very questions you were raising, I think, a lot, Eric. So here goes speaking qua early American historian. One of the most influential paradigms, I think, today for early American historians goes under the rubric, the history of the Atlantic world. Atlantic historians contend that the American story cannot be understood merely in terms of the English communities that eventually became the first 13 American states. Allison Games, David Armitage, and Alan Taylor, just to mention a few, write about expansive geographies and encounters between Anglo-American powers and indigenous peoples in Africa, the Caribbean, the Northeast Seaboard, even Canada. They range beyond Anglo-American affairs to explore the various interrelationships among English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires. Brett Rushforth and Laurent Dubois are describing the history of the French Atlantic. Jaime Rodriguez has begun to map the Spanish Atlantic. The Dutch Atlantic is now appearing in the literature. We can only hope that the Swedish Atlantic is not far behind. Atlantic history gives a sweeping account of Western and Christian culture spreading and circling throughout the Atlantic and into the Americas. It reaches back into the 17th century to probe for long-term political and intellectual transformations that abetted long-distance travel, colonial contests, and commercial networks. It prompts inquiries into how Western Europeans understood the meaning of encounter with the political and religious other, not only different Protestant sects or Catholic orders, but the real other, the native inhabitants of Western Africa, the Caribbean, and the Americas. My suggestion is that this pan-Atlantic approach challenges a long-standing tendency to analyze issues of religion and politics, such as the protection of individual rights, the possibility of a non-religious basis for political cohesion, and the relationship between law and divine revelation, to analyze these things almost exclusively within the domain of the creation of the United States. The traditional interpretation assumes a peculiarly American narrative culminating in the Revolution and constitutional settlement. So Thomas Kyd's recent God of Liberty illustrates this assumption. It places a bold line of demarcation between revolutionary America and Old World Europe, with its absolutist monarchies in league with state-sponsored churches. Taking his cue from Tocqueville, Kyd maintains that Americans achieved an innovative blending of popular religious conviction with formal or constitutional separation of church and state, a very familiar account. But the assertion of American originality also shapes more critical analyses, such as Carol Smith Rosenberg's Violent Empire, Andrew Preston's Sword of the Spirit, Shield of Faith, and Amanda Porterfield's Conceived in Doubt. These authors contend that religion served as an ideological justification for the worst of American political practices, xenophobia, self-promotion, and the exclusion of all but evangelical Protestants from public influence. Yet the overall thrust of these studies is the same: America was unique in such regards. So the New Atlantic history offers several correctives, or at least alternatives, to this American exceptionalism. To be sure, most of this work has minimized so far the explicit discussion of religion. Imperial politics and colonial conquest and slavery dominate the narratives. But it nonetheless can, I think, redirect our approach to religion and politics in America. It suggests that the practical, political, or constitutional dilemmas regarding religion and democracy in America, for good or ill, arose within the context of a long history of post-Reformation negotiations between religious tradition and the modern state or empire. Here's the Augustinian moment. Two particular implications of this history are relevant to our discussion. So I'll just mention two things. First, the Atlantic approach reminds us that the American colonies were founded as extensions of Europe and shaped by 17th century precedents for religion and politics. So here we stumble into the weedy and thorny terrain of the secular. So to simplify things, we can refer initially to what Charles Taylor has described in The Secular Age as what he calls the first meaning of the secular, what he also calls secularization. This involves, it's a political reality, the first meaning of the secular, the disengagement of theology from law and government without necessitating an abandonment of religious belief throughout society. A society in this sense can be thoroughly religious in popular belief, yet secular in law and government. Scholars of 17th century Western culture, such as Mark Somos, a historian of political philosophy, recently have stressed the growth of this political form of secularism in Europe after the wars of religion, especially after the 30 Years' War, ending with the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. Somos shows influential writers such as the biblical critic Joseph Justus Scaliger and the natural law philosopher Hugo Grotius took it as a religious duty to form conceptions of civil and international law apart from theological creed. And Stephen Nadler, a historian of philosophy, has explained how philosophers such as Arnaud, Bayle, Leibniz, and Malebranche, think back to Philosophy 101, shaped their debates around two convictions: the rational unavoidability of belief in the Christian God, and the urgent need for an intellectual system that would end Protestant-Catholic conflict, what they called the politique, They fashioned, that is, a highly theological version of the secular. Our narratives of American developments, that is, ought to incorporate an account of the very rise of secular political thought in the 17th century. We have underestimated, I think, how important such developments were. After all, the works of Grotius and Scaliger and Nadler's cast of characters were widely read in colonial America, taken for granted as state-of-the-art political commentary by religious divines and colonial political leaders alike. So what did it mean that Anglo-American immigrants to America came already with the notion of the secular in such terms? Perhaps this helps to explain what David Hall has described as the consensus-oriented local politics, even in Puritan New England, a form of communal negotiation that allowed for far more religious dissent than I think we have noticed. I do think we tend to tell the tale of not toleration, of persecution of dissent, and neglect all those steady state moments where there wasn't an exercise of power in such terms. What did it mean also that most European political theorists had developed ideas of international law that depended less on any one Christian tradition than on natural law? That, for example, Puritan leaders in New England sometimes appealed not to the Bible, but to Grotius in dealing with their Spanish and French competitors. Mark Peterson's forthcoming study of Boston deconstructs the old narrative of a tight-knit, closed society dominated by Puritan theocrats. Instead, he describes a social order built on the model of a city-state, economically powerful because it emulated great European cities whose commerce was regulated less by ecclesiastical doctrine than by international legal reason. Now to shift to the 18th century. That was just one century. We'll move to another. The Atlantic perspective, second, prompts us to place the relationship between religion and politics within the drive for empire among European states during the 18th century, the so-called long 18th century. Most Atlantic historians agree on this point. National ambitions, state building, and colonial expansion informed at least, or controlled at most, the political, economic, scientific, and cultural activity, and by cultural I also mean religious, across the Atlantic basin and into the North American mainland during the 18th century. This indirectly reflects what Charles Taylor calls his third form of the secular, or secularity. Here Taylor focuses on the widespread cultural assumption among Westerners, especially in the wake of the Enlightenment and rational religions such as deism, that no one set of religious beliefs were necessary for good citizenship or social standing. Religious identity was not a given, not embedded in social life, not a matter of recognizing the divine powers that impinged on everyday life as though they were incontestable objective facts. It was rather, and here modern philosophers such as Locke provided the rationale, an internal mental volition, a choice. Evangelicalism and skepticism became popular during the 1740s as religious options grounded in this idea of volition. Preachers of revival and proponents of religious rationalism equally called for deliberate self-determination, autonomous religious identity. Now, to be sure, Taylor's analysis does not begin with empire, yet it prompts us to consider how it was that the idea of a free religious conscience became widespread during the height of imperial sentiment in the 18th century. In logical terms, once religious and political leaders tethered the idea of religious belief to personal choice, the attendant question became this: well, by what criteria ought responsible citizens choose one religious option over the other? The language of Enlightenment moral philosophy, as several recent studies have argued, provided the answer by norms of reasonableness, moral benevolence, and humane sentiment or sensibility. And those terms, to make really short work of a very long story, implied politeness and patriotism and deference to the state. The political end or telos of moral decision-making appeared to be national well-being, hence empire and its market economies. And Sally's comments made me think that the rise of law as a place of adjudication has to do partly with the rise of commercial economies, when law needs to be the negotiator of credit and all sorts of social responsibilities. So the importance of law courts, which sort of soars numerically in this period, is very much related to this imperial move. Now, 18th century religious thinkers, to be sure, often chafed against a crudely nationalistic reading of moral philosophy, yet it is a historical fact that religious freedom and 18th century ideas about moral reasonableness and imperial sentiments converged. To illustrate with a simple example from the early 1750s, Benjamin Franklin, the skeptical rationalist, and George Whitefield, the itinerant evangelical, believed two things in common. First, the British government and its colonial administrations ought not to compel anyone to adhere to any one form of religious practice. And second, it ought to prosecute ferociously war against France and its Indian allies. Secularization theorists have been elucidating such logic for a long time. Talal Assad, Jose Casanova, Craig Calhoun, Mark Juergensmeyer have each argued in different ways that Western Enlightenment conceptions of moral virtue in a secular vein, Taylor's third sense of secularity, legitimated imperial ideologies. The secular did not void social decision-making of high moral purpose, but merely shifted the purpose from service to God to service to the nation, or a combination of Western empire and market capitalism, what I suppose Augustine would call idolatry. Now, cultural historians of the Atlantic world have begun to provide careful accounts of how literary and scientific production in the mid-18th century conformed to imperial agendas as well. Christopher Iannini and Ralph Bauer, for example, have suggested how the discovery and settlement of the New World involved what they call imperial epistemologies, that is, natural histories, cultural geographies, philological studies, and descriptions of non-Western religions from the Americas and other colonized regions, legitimated British or European political claims. An Atlantic cultural and intellectual history of the 18th century may suggest that we move outside of the typical narrative that once again severs America from Europe. Many of the older accounts of religion and politics in the colonial world focus on challenges to religious establishments in the British colonies, the rise of Protestant evangelicalism and immigration of America of sectarian groups such as Quakers or Moravians, along with the popularity of religious rationalism in urbane precincts, so the story goes, shaped a religiously pluralistic society that anticipated or necessitated later constitutional freedoms. But an Atlantic world approach provides a different perspective. It helps us to ponder how imperial understandings of geographical boundaries and political traditions and non-European religious practices affected notions of law and political rights. It helps us to fathom the extent to which national expansion and market systems replaced religious establishments. In this sense, it partially explains how the politics of disestablishment raised as many dilemmas as it supposedly solved. It was from the start entangled in a competition among the moral imperatives of nation, right, and creed. Historians, to conclude, however, ought not to be so captivated by such things in high theory and quoting Malebranche these days, the pure logic of things or elite thinkers, that they forget life on the ground. So I think the next move for us to make is to consider the extent to which the scenario I have laid out here does play out in the lives of common people. Was there a sense that early Americans had absorbed a century of European secular thinking about the political necessity for free religious conscience or a theology-free conception of law? If so, did American state building reduce the tendency to religious conflict, setting the condition for the constitutional settlement, even as it valorized empire? Do we need to attend, that is, as I suggested earlier, stories not of conflict, but of rapprochement, of religious indifference, of acceptance, of people actually getting along under this new national conception? Why did America not suffer any wars of religion? To flip the question around, however, the more that a nationalistic approach encompassed religious toleration, the less it appealed to the powerless, those who had no vested interest in the state. Secularism and nationalism, if they went together in such ways, were not able to reach down to those who had designs and aims elsewhere. Thank you.